Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are absolutely delighted to have Professor Petra Doan here with us to help launch the new series of Queerying Urbanism, which Claire and Ben will tell you more about shortly. So we're just going to start with a quick round of introductions, and then I'll pass over to Claire and Ben, who will tell you more about the series and introduce Professor Doan and her talk. So my name is Jordana Ramallo. I'm a lecturer in development planning for diversity at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Tunnicliffe. I'm a part-time PhD student researching queer practices of placemaking at the Bartlett, and I'm a grant-making officer at Give Out, a community foundation raising funds for LGBTQI activism.
Hi everyone, my name is Ben Campkin and I'm Professor of History and Theory of Architecture and Urbanism in the Bartlett School of Architecture and one of the co-directors of UCL's Urban Laboratory. So we're really delighted, as Jordana said, to welcome you all to this first event in our new online lecture series, Queerying Urbanism, which has been initiated by Be Queer, the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environments Network for LGBTQIA+ students, staff and allies. We're very grateful for the support of the Dean, Christoph Lindner, the former and current Vice Deans for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, Kamna Patel and Sarah Shafai, and also Sarah Rolfe in the Faculty Operations team. As the organisers, our intention for this series is to draw connections between queer and trans studies, urban studies and urban practice. Our aim is to provide a space for a sustained discussion of queer inclusive urbanisms that will bring forward speakers and evidence from a variety of contexts. We're interested in exploring how theoretical and methodological invention from queer and trans studies and activism inform or could inform urban studies and urbanism. There is, of course, a long history of urban geographies of sexuality back to the 1960s and also of gender, but today, mediated by technology, there is a resurgence of interest in queer space and place, and also a globalized queer activism, even while the challenges and terms in use are varied and context specific. We very much want to address these complexities, and when we began this conversation, we all had today's guest speaker, Professor Petra Doan, at the top of our wish lists, and so we're really pleased that this has become a reality. Before I introduce Professor Doan, I just want to explain that the format will be a talk of around 35 minutes, followed by a relatively brief Q&A. The event is being recorded and we encourage you to post your questions and comments using the Q&A function. Although time's tight, we'll do our best to get through some of the questions, and we hope also that the discussions will unfold through the series. If you want to use Twitter or Instagram, you can use the hashtag #QueerUrbanism. So to introduce our speaker, Professor Petra Doan is Professor in Urban and Regional Planning at Florida State University. She's a leading scholar internationally through her research on planning issues as they intersect with LGBTQIA+ communities. Many of you will know, for example, her acclaimed anthologies, Queerying Planning, Challenging Heteronormative Assumptions and Reframing Planning Practice, and Planning and LGBTQ Communities, the Need for Inclusive Queer Space. She's published a brilliant overview of the academic discussions around LGBTQ+ communities and gentrification in the Handbook of Gentrification Studies, edited by Loretta Lees and Martin Phillips. And in all of this work, she has encouraged us to think about the heterogeneity of LGBTQ+ populations and also the confluence of local and global processes in different urban contexts. Her contributions include groundbreaking accounts of transgender geographies and what she names the tyranny of gendered spaces, as well as the creation and demise of LGBTQ+ neighborhoods and networks. On the topics that she has explored in her work, Professor Doan has also been shaping a wider public and professional debate. She has a wealth of experience gained through working internationally and a specific interest in the relationship to queer scholarship and development studies. And we're particularly excited that today she's going to draw out insights from these intersections. So I'm really delighted to hand over to Professor Doan with a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Ben and Claire and Jordana. I am extremely pleased to be here. Both the Bartlett School and the DPU have been places I have been eager to visit, and I wish the situation were such that visits were easier in this pandemic and nearly post-pandemic period. But so anyway, I was just thrilled to be invited and to do this work. I'm going to share my screen now and get started with the talk. So the talk is Planning for LGBTQ Populations in the Global South, special focus on the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. The outline for the talk is that I'm going to try to deconstruct some of the research on planning and LGBTQ identities and spaces. I'm going to consider explicitly the relevance of this work on planning and LGBTQ identities for LGBTQ populations in the Global South. I'll draw on examples from the Middle East and examples from Sub-Saharan Africa, and then try to draw out a few implications for urban planning. But first, I'd like to queer my standpoint. This is a standard practice in feminist theory, and on a personal level, it's been a very mixed response. I spent the first half of my career doing urban planning work in the Middle East and Africa, Peace Corps in Togo. I did my master's field work in Cairo. I did doctoral research in Jordan. I went back and did senior Fulbright scholarship in Jordan. And I've done a bunch of consulting across some West African places. That was all prior to my gender transition roughly at the turn of the century. And so for the last 21 years, I've been focusing much more explicitly on LGBTQ populations and spaces in North America. In that work, I try to deconstruct what I consider to be the gender hegemony of the heteropatriarchy. That is, how is it that people's genders and interactions with other people is conditioned by patriarchal forces that reinforce heteronormativity? I would like to use, and I have found both queer geography, as Ben has talked, because when I began this work in around 2000, there was very little work done in the planning literature. So I turned to my queer geography friends and drew on some of their work, but I also drew on some work from queer theory. So I'm going to use a lens of queer theory to examine limitations on LGBTQ planning and urban development policy, just trying to deconstruct what in fact is going on. Well, just a little bit of background, because we are going to get into the Middle East and Africa shortly, but sort of where has scholarship started? Understanding LGBTQ spaces. David Bell writes that queer spaces, neighborhoods emerge at the margins of cities where people can find safety from this heteronormative gaze. That is, people looking at anyone who's different and giving them sort of the hairy eyeball, as we used to say in high school. People just nasty stares. Larry Knopp, another queer geographer, talks about the collective aspirations for safe spaces for marginalized LGBTQ people as a driving force that pulls people into these sort of queer spaces. But most research on LGBTQ spaces tends to focus on gay villages and gayborhoods. For instance, Alan Collins wrote this very interesting piece in Urban Studies about Soho, which is a neighborhood many of you may be familiar with, but he sort of developed this linear model of the evolution of a gay village, which was very nice and very interesting in its specificity, but is sort of very unsatisfying if we look at a much broader scale, because LGBTQ spaces and identities are very fluid. If we just track where queer spaces have moved in San Francisco, down on the waterfront, up to North Beach, down to Folsom Street, and then Cairo, and then the Castro. New York City moved all around Greenwich Village, and then moving further on up into Chelsea, and then I understand moving even further up the west side of Manhattan Island. In Chicago, moving from close to the Loop into into Boys Town, which is where everyone thinks about queer space in Chicago, but Boys Town isn't very queer anymore. Most of the queer folks have moved on to Andersonville, which is further up, further north. And many of these spaces are awfully much about white gay men. Heidi Nast and Charles Nero have sort of highlighted this. Charles Nero asked, why are queer spaces so white? So there's some questions about whether they even apply in the North American or Western European context, but do these ideas even transfer outside of the United States or the UK context, much less on a global scale? I would argue that we need to think about these things in a different way, a non-linear conceptual framework. And I'm going to take a couple of slides just to introduce that. So I think we need to think about how do we decenter urban theory. My dear friend Michael Frisch, a queer planner, wrote this wonderful piece in 2002 called Planning as a Heteronormative Project, in which he describes planning as a tool that has led to the erasure at times of queer diversity in North America. One of my favorite, not necessarily a queer scholar, but a scholar who's really critiquing our thinking about cities, Abdulmalik Simon, argues that we must decenter urban theory. But what does that mean? He means we need to reject this whole idea of subalterns and subaltern space, reject the concept of subalternity. And we need to recognize that cities are filled with what he calls systematicity and the plurality of groups and interests making claims. Cities aren't ever just one thing. They're full of systems and forces that are moving. And some of these ideas began percolating in my head. And so I began thinking, well, how do we apply these sorts of notions to queer spaces? Amin Ghaziani has, sort of raked Western scholarship on the coals for their fixation on neighborhoods. He questions the accuracy of that neighborhood model and wonders whether really what we should be thinking about is, rather than a single space, we should be thinking about mosaics of neighborhoods. Or then he goes on in a recent City and Community article to talk about cultural archipelagos that may be more appropriate. And that's sort of a nice notion, islands floating in a stream, but that wasn't satisfying for me because islands are fixed and these neighborhoods are fluid. So unless people are swimming or taking a little pirogue or something between the islands, it doesn't feel quite accurate enough. So I really want to explode the linear model and suggest that we might think of queer spaces as a kind of solar system. And yes, there are focal points at the center where it is perhaps the traditional gay village or a cluster of gay bars or lesbian bars, if you can find the lesbian bars, unfortunately. But there's a focal point for sure, but then around them, there are a whole range of LGBT communities that rotate and move closer and further away, depending on what? That's what I was struggling. How do we understand this sort of, how can we model this kind of fluidity? So I think we need to think about the orbital dynamics of queer communities. And in a recent piece I did with my doctoral student, Aslam Atale, we talked about the fact that there are centripetal forces that pull people, that attract people to the center. But at the same time, we cannot forget that there are centrifugal forces that push people away. And it's somehow understanding the push and the pull factors and sort of where a particular place is in terms of its local context, the local culture, explains a lot about whether we actually ever even have something that we could call a visible queer space. The relative strength of these forces explains a lot about LGBTQ visibility. And so just a couple of graphics, I'm not sure you'll be able to see them, but the centripetal forces pulling you to the center. If in the national context, there's a lot of disapproval of queer identities. People may be forced to leave rural areas and remoter regions and move to the city where they might find support. This is Kath Weston's argument. Get Thee to a Big City was an important article that she wrote many years ago now. And then they come to the city and then they find the areas where they can find support, where they can hold their partner's hand, where they can do public display of affection, where they can find some semblance of queer space and some place where they can feel somewhat less marginalized. And that's sort of the beginning of what Collins talks about in that Soho model. But at the same time, we have to be aware that there are these centrifugal forces that push in the other direction. So sometimes things at the center conditions are changing. Gentrification is happening. The neighborhoods are becoming full that might have in the 80s or 90s might have been full of queer people. And now there are a lot of baby stores and straight couples pushing baby strollers. And that makes it feel a little less safe for queer people to be there and to be openly queer. At the neighborhood level, similarly, but also things like affordability, affordable housing, availability of services. In Atlanta, the LGBT community center had to close and it moved, 10 miles outside of town, sort of in between Atlanta and Decatur at a midpoint. Not accessible. It is on the metro line, but far from the midtown neighborhood. And so and then the other thing that might help if there's wider acceptance in society so people can live wherever they want, then people may choose to move to places where they can live with their partner without getting stones thrown at them. But how does this apply to the global South? This is really the question that I'm trying to look at here. Well, we have to be very mindful as we think about the global South, about the hegemony of what I think of as Western identities, the letters in the LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer identities. If homosexuality is a Western construct, if that's sort of what Foucault said, homosexuality was created as an othering to sort of constrain heterosexual behaviors, is it even appropriate to apply these identities to the global South? I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm saying we must question and deconstruct whether it is. How do we avoid the trap of Orientalist assumptions? How do we avoid sort of adding on, exoticizing populations in the global South and thinking, oh, how interesting is this? Sort of queer tourism. And this can be immensely problematic, as I'll show in a minute. The urban South, the urban space in the global South is vastly conditioned by hegemonic post-colonial interests. The possibilities for marginalized and non-normative identities to control spaces is hugely contingent upon the local context. It is not linear in any way, shape, or form. We have to have this sort of notion of these competing forces that may allow something to be a little queer to pop up, and then it may get slapped down, and something that's a little queer may pop up over here. And these things are very, very variable. So thinking about the Middle East, historically, sexuality in the Middle East, there's been a huge range of diversity, whether they're the Mkhanith, who were, according to Rauschen, feminine men, sometimes eunuchs, who are written about in some of the Islamic texts, and talk about these people as singers. Now, women did the singing, but feminine men, the Mkhanith, could also do singing, and they were also sometimes picked to be the guardians of the holy places because they were perceived to be incorruptible vis-a-vis, sort of the lures of, send a pretty girl out to them and lure them away from their duty. Oni Wakan talks about the Zanith in Oman as a kind of third gender. Now, this is hugely controversial and sparked a whole range of controversy because Wakan may have been talking about a particular set of things and didn't fully understand the dimensions, but other scholars more recently have talked about a different set of people called the Khanif in the Gulf states, both Almaty and Makia, have sort of talked about the fact that today there is a tradition of the Khanif, and these Khanif seems to have spread these identities from Oman down into what was the Sultanate of Zanzibar, the coastal areas of Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and even Madagascar, where there was populations as well. Part of this went with trade. Some of this was the Arab slave trade, but this tradition of differently oriented and possibly differently gendered populations sort of spread right down that east coast of Africa. So, but Abu Khalil, an Arab scholar, says that they found a pamphlet, a clerical pamphlet, that said it was the VCR, the video cassette recorder from the West, that spread the practice of homosexuality among Arab men. Apparently, queer people, however they call themselves, have existed for a long time. But let's blame the West for this. Ahmed Ahmadinejad, the ex-president of Iran, said in Iran we don't have homosexuals, but of course that's patently false. Today, the internet has replaced the VCR, but does the hegemony of identity effectively still erase this panoply of non-normative identities? I think this is where we need to be very careful in terms of thinking about letting people use words and claim identities for themselves, and not sort of reading onto them our own queer affect, if you will. Joseph Massad talks about there are a number of large LGBTQ human rights groups that try to impose, as Massad argues, a Western imperialist identity, but they fail to understand the Arab frame of reference. The gay agenda, Massad says, of some groups has created a right-wing backlash by pushing sort of the rights of gay people. They've created a backlash, and I'll talk about that briefly when I talk about the Cairo case in just a minute. But Massad is very concerned that the attempt to liberate Arab social and sexual worlds actually puts those who are being saved at great risk of crackdowns, of sort of repercussions from not so friendly governments and political groups. So we have to think about more interconnected queerness. Saad Atshan, a queer Palestinian scholar, says in the US and Europe have no monopoly on queerness. That queerness exists in almost everywhere. And he says there are some similarities with the queer Arab experience in the Middle East, but there are also critical differences. And Atshan also raises up the idea of technology and the ability of social media to enable increased openness about LGBTQ issues among young people around the world. You can't put stuff back in the bottle once you can find stuff, different identities on the web, but that is a kind of hegemony. Let me talk briefly about the case of Istanbul that my doctoral student and colleague Azlema Atalay and I have done, talking about the neighborhood of Beyoğlu and two sub areas of Talabashi and Cihangir. And that's a picture of Beyoğlu. Note the rainbow flag flying from the building, because Beyoğlu had a fairly high concentration of queer people, but also it was a very multicultural space and has been a very diverse neighborhood for many generations. When I was visiting Istanbul for one of the ASOP conferences there, I was amazed to wander around some of the neighborhoods in Beyoğlu that felt very much like Western Europe, for all I could see. I had just come from Jordan and was very familiar with the Middle Eastern context, and Istanbul is this wonderful mix. So Beyoğlu was a very multicultural neighborhood, and queer identities flourished there. Queer people were drawn to the area, but not in a completely visible manner. LGBTQ spaces were hidden, but in plain sight. A restaurant would have normal hours, and then after hours, it sort of functioned as a kind of a club where people who were known could come in and do some social organizing, do some simple socializing, and create community in this public space that was no longer fully public. Movie theaters are places, and we'll talk about the Emek Theater in just a minute, and public parks. We'll talk about Gezi Park also in just a minute. Unfortunately, Istanbul has experienced what I call neoliberal queer erasure. The municipality of Istanbul, prompted by Erdogan and his AKP party, to see that the diversity and subjectivity in Beyoğlu were urban problems that needed to be eliminated, at least according to Adana. And so they created these associations to beautify Beyoğlu, and particularly the Cihangir Neighborhood Association, trying to beautify the neighborhood, where beautification really meant erasing trans, queers, and other non-conforming people to make the areas safe for gentrification. I was particularly interested, given my history, of the role of trans folks in Istanbul. This is a picture from a special issue on Merib, the Middle East report on sexuality in the Middle East that I highly recommend. It was from a number of years ago. And they talk about Olker Street near Taksim Square, where Demir, who recently won an International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Committee award, talked about there were 70 of us living on the street, which for a trans person feels like a huge concentration of trans people, but suddenly they were down to only 7 people. And in 1996, these trans women were all forced out so that gentrification in Cihangir could continue. There was a lot of neoliberal urban renewal. The government pushed forward this law for the protection of deteriorated historic and cultural heritage through renewal and reuse. This is quite a bizarre way of framing historic preservation, but it was basically, you can tear down the historic buildings to create something new. So it isn't historic preservation in any way that I understand it. It is all about neoliberal urban renewal. They incentivize large-scale redevelopment in, say, the Tarlabaşı sub-district. There's a picture of some of the Tarlabaşı reconstruction where they've torn down the buildings in the front to create new spaces for development. And this also was combined with the desire to suppress dissident cultures in Beyoğlu's various streets and local establishments. I understand, Özlem reports when she goes back to Istanbul, that there are still many queer people living in Beyoğlu, but the visibility has diminished considerably. They have to be much more careful. The Emek movie theater was both a theater where queer people would gather, but it also became an emblem. Emek is ours, Istanbul is ours, as they tried to keep this theater from being redeveloped. Yasser in 2019 talks about the rhetoric of safety that was used to justify suppressing opposition voices and political organizing, and basically to try to squash the queer community. Beautification was a tool to erase diversity and its multicultural past. Unfortunately, the movie theater was torn down in 2013, and that set the tone for what was to happen several months later with the Gezi Park protests. Now, Gezi Park is a large park very close to in the Taksim area, beautiful park that the city in its infinite wisdom, maybe not, planned to redevelop as a rebuilt Taksim military barracks. That's a picture of what the military barracks used to look like. And they were going to create a shopping mall that looked like that right on top of this beautiful park. That triggered massive public protests and Istanbul's first experience of what was kind of an Occupy Gezi movement that brought wide support, not just from the queer community, the multicultural community, but many progressives and leftists came, and the camp they built a camp where they lived for months. Now, of course, the government tried to suppress them, and they were forced out, and they forced their way back in. The protests spread across the country and was in fact quite successful, because eventually the redevelopment plans were withdrawn. But this kind of neoliberal development is the subject of huge amounts of controversy. I want to move on, I'm aware of time, and talk briefly about Cairo. Well, Cairo, of course, as you know, was saw massive urban growth in the 20th century. But in the 1990s, Cairo was in the midst of this growth surge, and the city government turned a blind eye to sexual difference in particular, and many gay men were attracted to the city, some from other parts of the Middle East, and they were particularly attracted to the nightclubs on the Nile. There were these sort of moored riverboats. Some of them traveled up and down the Nile, but mostly they were moored along the Nile and functioned as nightclubs. There was one particular nightclub called the Queen Boat that tended to have a very queer clientele. And in 2001, there was an immense crackdown on this Queen Boat disco site. 52 gay men were arrested after visiting the Queen Boat Club, and they had not one, but two different trials because there was huge public outcry. They tried them again, and they used an old British law from the British colonial period that was intended to eradicate prostitution, but here we could reapply it, said the Egyptian courts, to these men who were clearly gay. And of course, the men were subjected to all kinds of indignities, imprisonment, and it really ended the era of increased visibility. Was there queer space in Cairo? I don't think it ever really evolved. There were a few queer places. This public crackdown on gays is the kind of thing that Mossad was worried about from before. Awad says, was this a distraction? He argues that it was an attempt to divert attention away from economic woes of the economic liberalization and rescue masculinity from socioeconomic insecurities. But it was also perhaps an appeal to reactionary groups. The Mubarak regime wished to counter the Islamic Brotherhood and to burnish its image as a keeper of public morality. So what better way than to smack down those gays who happen to be having just a lovely time on a boat along the Nile. I want to turn also to Africa, because what we're seeing is this tension between rising visibility and eventual crackdown by these post-colonial neoliberal regimes. In Africa, gender and sexuality are highly contextually and spatially contingent. Ahmad Yume says that the penetration of Africa by Christian colonial regimes and missionaries destroyed traditional religious practice and undermined any kind of Western, non-Western conceptions of gender and sexuality. But Mark Eprecht, the South African scholar, argues, but sexuality is diverse in Africa, and the claim that homosexuality does not exist. Robert Mugabe claimed there were no gays in Africa, it was just a colonial import, much like Ahmadinejad. Homosexuality does not exist, says Eprecht, is patently false. There are clearly experiences of non-normative sexuality throughout history in various parts of Africa. Well, let's turn to the South African case, because South Africa is particularly interesting. Post-colonial African elites have used a kind of Foucaultian discourse of heteronormativity to undermine and other deviant sexualities, that is, deviant from the post-colonial regime's values that have been inculcated by the effects of colonialism and evangelism. South Africa may have been an exception because in the post-apartheid constitution, sexual orientation was baked in to the constitution as a right. So therefore we should see things are better in South Africa, or not. Could this be a model for instituting change? Possibly, but it isn't about rights, it's about how things happen. So let's look at the case of Cape Town very briefly. Now, if we look at the historical development map of Cape Town that's provided from the Cape Town Planning Authority, the darkest areas, I know you can't see the scale, but the blacks and the grays and the browns date from the 19th century and on into the early 20th centuries, and the blues and the pinks and the oranges are much more recent settlements. So you can see this is Table Bay, this is Table Mountain, and this is the area that's known as False Bay. And so the city has expanded outward. This is the Flats, which is an area where there were traditional apartheid townships. But we can also see the same sort of pattern when we look at an index of socioeconomic need. This is also from the Cape Town Planning Authority. And so here, the darkest green areas are the best off, and the lighter green less off, the yellow sort of average. And then the oranges and the reds are areas where there is the highest socioeconomic need. And these, of course, are the former township areas. And this is important because this tells the story of queer space as well in Cape Town. Andrew Tucker quotes one of his informants, Lewis, as saying, Cape Town was like a vacuum cleaner, sucking up people who've outgrown their hometowns and pulling them. And I thought this was a nice example of centripetal force, pulling people into Cape Town where they could find acceptance. Because if you've outgrown your hometown, presumably you are no longer welcome there. De Waterkant is perhaps the most visible queer space in Africa. And here is De Waterkant. This is Table Bay here. This is Table Mountain. So in between the bay and the mountain, there is an area called De Waterkant. And some people have called it a gay village. But Gustav Visser says while there are pride parades that happen through De Waterkant, and there are some gay establishments, some bars and all, he doesn't feel it meets the criteria at all of sort of a Western gay ghetto, that this doesn't really describe what's happening in this part of Cape Town. In fact, to understand Cape Town, we have to think about the ways in which race and class continue to segment the city, even in the post-apartheid era. This is according to Andrew Tucker. So let's also think about non-white queer identities. De Waterkant is very queer, but also very white. Non-white queer identities, diverse racialized identities, for instance, among the colored community, traditionally, there was a group called the Mafis. This is a name that they called themselves. These were gay men who dressed effeminately, often in women's clothes, and had a lovely time. They had parties, they had outings, they were primarily located in what was known as District 6, which isn't too far from De Waterkant. It's on the down below Table Mountain. So here's a picture of what District 6 looked like at one point. But at the end of the apartheid era, the government decided that having this presence of so many colored people so close to the CBD, and so many of these colored people being Mafis and queer, they moved them out. And so they destroyed District 6. And today it is much of it is still an open field, although some of it is where the Cape Technicon has been created, but there's still a vast open field where there used to be houses and vital locations. And they moved them across to Cape areas, not in Cape Flats, but surrounding Cape Flats, those areas that I showed had the highest socioeconomic need. But there are also Black queer identities in the townships, in Langa, in Guguletu, in Nyangu, in Philippi, in Kayaliche. These are very poor communities. This is a photo of Kayaliche. But the identities were also quite interesting. Tucker talks about people referring to themselves as Ivies, meaning sort of more effeminate gay men, or pantsulas, where pantsulas are very sort of masculine appearing gay men. And so these sort of two identities that don't exactly map, I mean, they're clearly men who have sex with men, if we want to use a broader term, but don't exactly map onto our Western notion of what gays are, at least a a homonormative version of what gays are. But the townships, there's still a queer population in the townships. This is a photo of contestants preparing for a Mr. and Mrs. Gay Ikazi celebration. And so here they are practicing their walks. And these are mostly gay men, some perhaps, if we use their words, Ivies, some perhaps Pantsulas, the Mr. and the Mrs. Gay Ikazi. So clearly there is still a population in the townships that's very queer, but there's a lot of resistance in those now former townships. They are full places of their own. Violence against gay men is high, and there are more than, according to a BBC report of 10 years ago, more than 10 Black lesbian rapes a week. So clearly it is a very dangerous place to be non-normatively oriented or non-normatively gendered. What do we do about this in terms of planning? Well, thinking about planning, we need to be much more conscious about listening. Local voices are key to resisting discrimination. In Istanbul, Lambda Istanbul, Kaos, GL is in Istanbul, but also in Ankara. Gender Dynamics is a queer group in South Africa that works on gender issues. So we need to understand that there are groups, and we need to, as planners, tune in to who these groups are and what their needs are, how they conceive of what would help them or hurt them. We need to recognize the importance of names and identities, gender inclusive identities. Perhaps men who have sex with men or women who have sex with women may be the most inclusive terms, but words like Ivies or Khaneth may also be important terms to use. And then we need to think about enabling these populations. We need to work with these less visible LGBTQ stakeholders without compromising them. Let them lead. Let them tell you, as a planner who may be on a consulting mission or maybe working for the city government, let them tell you what their needs are and how those needs might be met. We do need to be aware of preserving the centripetal spaces that have been places of safety where people can gather at the center. The value of LGBTQ historical sites, both Emek Theater and Gezi Park, need to be preserved if it can be managed against the ravages of neoliberal gentrification. We need to recognize that bars and clubs may be community focal points. They may be places where loud music and people gather, and that's uncomfortable for some people, but for this community, they may be really critical. And we also need to think about alternative family and household arrangements. Affordability of housing is critical, but also providing HIV/AIDS services and other health services related to the community, particularly in terms of gender transition services, perhaps, but also then being particularly mindful of services for queer youth who may have been no longer welcome at home and have migrated to the city and may have very little means to support themselves. And also our queer elders need to be reminded. With that, I will stop there, and because I think I've run on a bit.
Thank you, Petra. Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you so much for such a rich presentation and really taking us on a journey to these different contexts. We have about 50 minutes for Q&A, so I'm going to try and be swift and brief. But I just personally, there's so much I want to pick up on, but there's definitely this proposition you make for orbital dynamics of queer communities really spoke to me, because some of my work is thinking through queer constellations, building on the work of Jen Jack Giesking and Diane Chisholm. And I just find it really fascinating that so often when we talk about queer space, we actually turn to queer space and this idea that keeps coming back. Before I do go any further with that line of thinking, I have no doubt that our audience will have a ton of questions. So I'm really encouraging you to drop them in the Q&A, and we'll try and get to them, get through as many as possible. I did want to start with a couple of my own. And I'm going to step back a little, and this is a question we're going to be asking all of our speakers as part of this series, but given the name of this series, what for you would it mean to queer urban? What would you prioritize and why? And I think a lot of what you've been talking about this afternoon speaks to that, but I wanted to put that question to you.
Sure. I mean, I think we need to be careful about sort of, as we use the terms queering urbanism, it's a rich, lovely term. I love the idea that you're having a series on it. But the question of queering is always queering by whom and for whom. So if we are queering urbanism, who is doing the queering, and what is their comfort level with that queering? If queering is by the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Organization, and they're trying to queer space in Egypt, and it creates a backlash, that's not really helpful. And so as long as queering urbanism arises from representatives of the queer communities, however they self-define, and then wish to find ways that they can reshape space. So in terms of planners and queer urbanism, what can we do but listen hard? Listen from our hearts before we think with our minds about how to make things better. So much of planning initiatives, and I've struggled with this through my career, is how can I fix this? How can I make it better? How can I make it better? As opposed to how can I listen to what are the expressed needs of the community that may be very difficult to reach. So one of the problems with queering urbanism is there may be very different perceptions of queerness. In Cape Town, gay white men may be fairly empowered, and Der Waterkant may be the area that they think is going to be perfectly queer. But the Mafis, the queer colored folks who had a community that got destroyed by during the end of the apartheid era, and then had to reconstruct their communities over near Cape Flats. This is very difficult. What are their needs, and how are those needs different than the needs of the white gay men? And then people, the mostly Xhosa people living in the places like Khayelitsha, what would queering urbanism mean for them? How might their spaces be made somewhat more accommodating? So we have to really think that the queer population is not homogeneous. It is very diverse in and of itself. And so queering urbanism becomes a really tricky, but vitally important task.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think definitely something as part of this series of being able to listen better is a message that we will take forward as well, Petra, from your talk. I wanted to pick up on something that you've obviously written a lot about in your work. You've called on planners to think beyond a narrow fixation of what queer space is. You spoke about it just now, it being tightly linked to gay villages developed in the 80s and 90s in the US, in Western Europe, in Australia. But I'm wondering what do Istanbul, Cairo, or Cape Town kind of offer as a shifting away from this narrow fixation? What are the possibilities of thinking and naming queer space differently?
Well, so one of the things that one of the motivations for me for the Istanbul work was, again, that I have a queer doctoral student from Istanbul, and we've had lots of rich conversations about what is queer space, and they find that queer space very, very interesting, but much of the literature about Western queer spaces didn't seem to apply. But then if we extend our historical sort of perspective a little further, I have on my shelf this book about gay New York by George Chauncey, and Chauncey describes the queer spaces in New York as being this back corner of this restaurant in New York where there was sort of a queer table where people would gather. And that's much more like what is happening in Istanbul now, which is where we sort of came to the idea of needing to understand these sort of contrasting forces and how at different times. So I think we will look back on this period of the 1980s and 1990s in the West as this moment. Maybe it's a transformational moment, or maybe it's a blip. I really can't tell at this point. As a trans person, I feel like currently I have a target painted on me, given some of the politics, Republican politics explicitly in the United States. And so I am not entirely optimistic about what's going to happen. So there are forces of sort of real openness, and then there are forces of closing down. And so what we can learn by looking at Istanbul or Cairo or Cape Town, these are places where these forces are active. And it takes us out of the mindset that there is one linear development pattern. It's not linear, it goes up and down. It's a sine wave, or if you will. It comes and it goes like the tides, perhaps maybe a better metaphor, where sometimes you have a very high tide and you reach way up the beach and everything feels great, and then suddenly the tide goes out and you're stranded up on the beach. And it's nice for someone to come along and find little things stranded up on the high tide line. But if you're the one who's stranded, it's not very nice when people come in and sort of look at you. Maybe that's too metaphorical.
I'm here for it. Anything to do with the ocean tides, I'm here for it. I am very conscious of time, so I might see if I can wedge in one of my questions at the end, but I do want to open it up to Ben and Jordana. If you've got a question to put to Petra, and then I'm going to pick up on some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A function. Do either of you want to jump in?
I will, or Jordana, would you like to? Thank you for the amazing talk, Petra. It was really comprehensive and gave us lots of tools to think with around our topic as we explore queering urbanism. I wanted just to pick up on what you see as the challenges of incorporating inclusivity of non-normative genders and diverse genders and sexualities within international urban policy frameworks. So how might that be addressed in ways that accommodate diversity and local difference whilst prioritizing equity at a kind of global scale? Because it seems to be something that becomes a sticking point in discussions, for example, around the UN New Urban Agenda and so on. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I took some slides out that talked about how 2011, we thought 2011 was going to be kind of a watershed, because both the UN came out and recognized sort of gender and sexuality as human rights, and Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State in the Obama administration, said sexual rights are human rights. And so if we take a human rights framework and think, I'm not sure that the United Nations is really the top, but if we think top down, I don't think that that's necessarily helpful, because we get, as I think you were alluding to, Ben, a lot of pushback from various locations and actors. Certainly, any of the work around women's rights has had the same kind of pushback. So trying to push a human rights agenda, trying to push a queer agenda, a queering agenda, is just going to create all kinds of pushback. When I did my graduate work in planning at Cornell University, and when I got there, the students were all wearing a t-shirt that I didn't get because they were out of them, but it was planning gorillas in the bureaucracy, not gorillas like ape, but gorillas like counter-revolutionaries in the bureaucracy. And I think that sometimes when we think about queering, it can't always happen straight up, top down. We're going to make this a more queer-friendly place. You gotta not lead, you have to listen and lift. And I think that's critical in working with these populations who can be very vulnerable. And so how do we do queering urbanism? Lots of ways, but you got to get out there, not with your, I'm a planner from the DPU, or I'm a planner from Cornell or Florida State, and I'm here to make your city queer. That's not gonna go anywhere. But if you can go out with an openness and an attitudinal sort of awareness of who's being included and who isn't, how are these populations, what do they perceive their needs to be, and how can we work on sort of marginal changes? I hate to say it, incremental planning, but I think it's the only way to try to ensure the safety of these populations, because queer people across the globe are at great risk at different times. Certainly in the United States, Black trans women are the most heavily murdered population that we have. The murder rate in that community is appalling, and we're sort of not the US alone, but in the West, we're kind of a bastion of queerness and, welcoming inclusivity, but not when people are getting up and ranting and raving about transgender criminals in bathrooms, trans women trying to pee who are criminalized in that way. It creates a kind of backlash that's really fierce.
Yeah, absolutely. Jordana, did you want to jump in?
Thanks.
Well, I think given time, maybe let's just go straight to some of the questions from the audience.
Perfect. Sorry, I just wanted to put it
to you. Yeah, no, thanks, Claire.
You might get a few emails with follow-up questions, Petra, to be sure. Can you see the Q&A function? Otherwise, just because I want to give you the opportunity to perhaps pick one, given time constraints, that you might want to speak to instead of picking for you.
All right, so one is about nationwide or regional or city. Yes, it certainly is city level. Nationwide is much too broad a scope. Zoom in on trans experiences and resistance in public spaces. I would love to do that. I didn't focus on the trans experience in this talk explicitly. I just didn't have time. I think it's really important. Non-normative, what does non-normative gender justice in planning policy look to you? Oh, these are really wonderful questions. Describe an approach to planning. I'm just going to read them all before I try to jump into any, so that people at least feel that they are heard. Do you see an approach to planning takes into account time as a concept, especially through this push-up, push-pull process? I can't even keep up. There's so many thoughts coming in here.
I just, very briefly, is the link going to close very abruptly at 2?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you, Abby. Okay. Go. If everyone's happy to hang on just for a couple moments more, I will let Petra answer one of the questions.
One of the questions. Okay. Well, I'm gonna speak to the one that that comes to my heart in terms of well, so we sort of use the spatial metaphor as Jordana or Claire talked about, sort of space as a concept. But if we talk about the space-time continuum, how can we talk about space without talking about time? Because we're all moving through time. In my Tyranny of Gendered Spaces piece in Gender, Place, and Culture, one of the metaphors that sort of sticks with me is that as we move through spaces, they change while we're moving through them, but so does our presentation as we move through them. In Charlotte, North Carolina, there is in the airport, there are 2 moving sidewalks that go in different directions. And sort of, I feel like that's a little bit how we add the time dimension to all of these spaces, is that every moment is a snap in time, but both people's perceptions of me as I'm going down the sidewalk are shifting. But as I'm going down the sidewalk, if I see someone, for instance, with a Confederate flag on their shirt, my presentation sort of straightens up and looks a little less overtly queer, just for self-protection. When I go through South Georgia on my way to Atlanta, where I've done a lot of research, I have to sort of straighten up my gender presentation. So the time element is critical, and that isn't as clear in my centripetal and centrifugal notions, but time, where, not just context, but when. What just happened the day before? Was there just a big political rally where people have gotten all hyped out of control about how we have to get rid of all these queer people? And I walk through that space as an overtly queer person. The time element is absolutely critical in terms of the way that those forces work. So yes, thank you. Time is really important to that push-pull process as we move through time and space.
Super interesting point, which I wish we had more time to go into, to be honest. But I'm gonna have to unfortunately stop you there, Petra, and thank you so much for this conversation, which is only leading to more questions. I'm gonna hand over to Jordana to close today and point you to what's coming next. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Claire. And Petra, thank you again. I think you've given us an awful lot to think about in relation to intersectionality, rethinking space and how we think through queer space, the politics of naming, and so much more in time, and how that kind of the complexities of time-space continuum. So thank you, Petra. I look forward to continuing the conversation and maybe inviting you back in the future if you'd be able to come. So yeah, no, thank you. I think we've taken so much from this. Before we close, I just wanted to thank the audience for joining us for the launch of this series. We're so delighted that you could be here. We hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure you did. And we want to let you know that the next event is going to be with Dr. Diran Borissa, who's a Dalit queer activist, poet, and urban sexual geographer, as well as an assistant professor at Jindal Global Law School in Delhi. And he's going to be speaking to us about peripheral desires of ephemeral cities, imagining queer geographies in India, which focuses specifically on his efforts to map Dalit queer lives in Delhi using autoethnographic storytelling. So we hope that you can join us for that. There is more details on the Queerying Urbanism site, which is included in the link above. So please sign up. Looking forward to seeing you next time. And Professor Doan, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.